The morning sun filtered weakly through the cracked wooden shutters, painting soft golden lines across the faded photographs on the wall. In those pictures, a much younger woman stood proudly beside her late husband, surrounded by children with bright, hopeful eyes. That woman was Amira, now a frail grandmother with silver hair and tired hands that had once worked endlessly to feed those same children. To the world, Amira was simply an old woman. But to her family, she had once been the backbone, the reason they had a roof above their heads, the reason there was food on the table when times were rough, the reason they had gone to school instead of working in fields. Her sacrifices had been countless and silent, woven into sleepless nights and aching bones. Yet, as Amira grew weaker with age, those very children she had built her life around began to turn away from her. At first, it was small things. Her eldest son, Farhan, stopped calling as often. Her daughter, Samira, once so affectionate, began rolling her eyes at Amira's advice, muttering, "Times have changed, Mama. You don't understand." But soon, the small cracks became deep wounds. Amira's savings, money she had carefully tucked away for emergencies, were borrowed by her children again and again. Each time, they promised to return it, swearing it was just a temporary need. She gave without hesitation, trusting that love and gratitude would bring the money back. But the repayments never came. Worse, they began to see her as a burden. One evening, Amira overheard a conversation that pierced her heart like a blade. She had gone to fetch a glass of water when her children, sitting in the living room, began discussing her as if she wasn't even there. "She can't keep living here forever," Samira hissed. "She takes up space. I mean, she doesn't even help anymore. All she does is sit there, looking sad." Farhan sighed. "We could rent out her room for good money. Why not just send her to an old age home? It'll be better for her too." Amira froze in the hallway, her trembling hand tightening around the glass. Every word struck her like thunder. The home she had built brick by brick with her husband was now considered too valuable to waste on her. She returned to her room, shut the door quietly, and for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to cry. Silent tears streamed down her face as memories flooded in, of rocking her children to sleep, of selling her jewelry to pay their school fees, of skipping meals so they could eat. And now, the same children plotted to discard her like an old, useless cloth. The betrayal deepened when the grandchildren, once her joy, began imitating their parents' cruelty. Her little granddaughter, Noor, used to run into her arms every morning, demanding stories of when Amira was young. Now, Noor wrinkled her nose at the sight of her, whispering to her cousin, "Grandma smells weird." The sting was unbearable, not because Noor meant harm, but because children learn quickly from what they see. Amira's heart cracked, not at the words of the child, but at the coldness that had been planted there by her own children. Then came the day that broke her completely. On her late husband's death anniversary, Amira prepared a small prayer at home. She set out his favorite dish, lentils and rice, on the table, lit a candle beside his photograph, and waited for her children to join her in remembering the man who had given them everything. But no one came. Instead, her son Farhan stormed into the kitchen, scolding her. "Why are you wasting money cooking all this? Do you think prayers will bring him back? We need to think about the living, not the dead." Samira chimed in cruelly. "Honestly, Mama, you cling to the past too much. You need to stop acting like we owe you something. We all have our own lives now." Those words shattered her more than any financial loss ever could. "We don't owe you anything." Her lips trembled as she placed the food away. She did not argue, did not defend herself, did not remind them of the nights she had gone hungry so they could eat. Instead, she walked silently back to her room, clutching her husband's photograph to her chest, whispering, "They've forgotten us, haven't they?" That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, the thought crept into her mind. Maybe they truly don't want me anymore. The trust she had built her entire life upon, the belief that love, loyalty, and sacrifice were repaid in kind, was crumbling into dust. And though her body was frail, her heart still beat with an ache so deep that it felt like betrayal itself was consuming her. But beneath the pain, somewhere in the darkness of her soul, a spark flickered, a small, stubborn flame that whispered, "This isn't the end, Amira." The days that followed felt endless. The house that Amira had once filled with warmth, laughter, and the aroma of fresh bread now echoed with silence, or worse, with whispers that weren't meant for her ears. She had always believed that a mother's place was sacred within the family, but now she found herself tiptoeing around her own home, as though she were an intruder. The betrayal wasn't just in their words, it was in the way they looked at her. Farhan, once the little boy who used to grip her hand so tightly on his way to school, now barely glanced at her. When she spoke, he responded with irritation, as though her voice itself was a burden. Samira, who had once braided Amira's hair while listening to stories of her youth, now snapped at her for the smallest mistakes, spilling a cup of tea, leaving the door ajar, humming to herself in the kitchen. The home that was supposed to be her safe haven had turned into a cage of cold glares and sharp words. One afternoon, Amira decided to step outside for a walk to clear her head. She had barely made it down the street when she overheard two neighbors speaking in hushed voices. "Isn't that Amira?" one asked. "Yes," the other replied with a pitying sigh. "I heard her children want to send her away. Imagine, after everything she did for them." Amira's steps faltered. The gossip cut deeper than knives because it confirmed what she already knew. Her shame was no longer private. Her pain had become a story for others to whisper about. She returned home, her eyes burning with unshed tears, only to find her belongings, her late husband's coat, her old sewing machine, even her prayer rug, pushed into a corner. It was as if her life was being erased piece by piece. Nights were the worst. She would lie in bed, clutching her husband's photograph, replaying the voices of her children in her mind. "We don't owe you anything." The words echoed, hollow and cruel. Sometimes she whispered back into the darkness, "But I gave you everything." Her health began to decline. Food lost its taste, her hands shook when she tried to sew, and sleep slipped further away each night. She wasn't just lonely, she was haunted by memories. She remembered carrying her children through sickness, walking miles to fetch water, selling the last piece of jewelry her husband had gifted her so that Samira could attend college. Every memory that once brought pride now felt like a wound. The breaking point came one stormy evening. Rain lashed against the windows as Amira sat alone at the dinner table, a small plate of bread and soup before her. Her children had already eaten without her, leaving her to fend for herself. The house was filled with laughter, her grandchildren playing a game in the living room, Farhan and Samira chatting loudly. But not one of them had asked if she wanted to join. Her hands trembled as she tore a piece of bread, staring at the emptiness of her plate. For the first time, she felt invisible. Her chest ached with a heaviness she could no longer carry. She pushed the plate away, stood slowly, and shuffled to her room. As she closed the door, the noise from the living room faded, replaced by the sound of her ragged breathing. She fell to her knees beside her bed, clutching the edge of the mattress, whispering into the silence. "Why, Allah? Why did I raise them with so much love, only to be left alone in this way? What did I do wrong?" Her sobs shook the small room. It was not just grief. It was the trauma of realizing she had been abandoned, not by strangers, but by her own blood. The following weeks blurred together. Amira stopped speaking much. She stayed in her room, too weak to argue, too tired to defend herself. The world outside her window moved on. Children played in the street. Neighbors hung laundry. Life went on. But for her, time had frozen in a loop of silence and sorrow. Samira would occasionally enter, tossing a plate of food onto the table. "Eat something," she'd mutter without looking at her. Farhan avoided her altogether. The grandchildren stopped visiting her room. Amira was alive, but she was no longer living. Yet, even in those darkest days, the smallest glimmer of strength stirred within her. One night, as she sat alone, she opened a small wooden box hidden beneath her bed. Inside were letters her husband had written to her decades ago. His handwriting, strong and sure, carried words of love and resilience. "You are stronger than you believe. Whatever happens, never let this world break you." Her tears fell onto the fragile paper, but her heart clung to the words. For the first time in many months, she felt something other than despair. A quiet thought flickered within her. If he believed in me once, maybe I can still believe in myself. The flame was small, almost invisible, but it was there, glowing faintly in the ashes of her heartbreak. The world had pushed her to the edge of despair, but somewhere deep inside, Amira's spirit refused to be extinguished. The days blurred into weeks, and the weeks into months. Amira had grown used to the silence of her room, the loneliness pressing in from every corner. Yet, amid the suffocating darkness, that small flame inside her, ignited by her husband's old letters, refused to die. It began with something simple. One morning, she forced herself out of bed earlier than usual. The house was still quiet, the children asleep, her son and daughter already gone for work. Amira stepped into the kitchen and brewed a cup of tea for herself. The warmth of the cup in her hands reminded her of better times, of mornings when she used to prepare food for everyone, filling the home with a sense of belonging. She whispered to herself, "I'm still here. I'm still alive." For the first time in months, those words did not feel hollow. That week, Amira decided to take a short walk each day. At first, her steps were slow and shaky, her body weakened from neglect. But with each passing morning, she found her legs growing stronger, her lungs filling more deeply with the fresh air of dawn. The neighbors, once pitying her, began to notice her quiet resilience. One old friend, Khadija, stopped her in the street. "Amira, it's been so long," she said warmly, grasping her hands. "I thought you had disappeared." Amira smiled faintly, though her eyes were tired. "I almost did, Khadija. But I think I am finding my way back." That brief conversation planted something new in her heart. She realized that outside the walls of her home, outside the coldness of her children, there was still kindness, still a world where she mattered. Soon after, Amira began attending the local women's group at the community center. At first, she sat quietly in the back, listening as others shared their struggles: widows, mothers abandoned by their children, women who had endured poverty and loss. She had thought her pain was unique, but as she listened, she realized she was not alone. Her story was echoed in theirs, and theirs in hers. One day, when the group leader encouraged her to speak, Amira hesitated. But then she remembered her husband's words: "You are stronger than you believe." Her voice trembled at first, but she told her story, the sacrifices she had made, the betrayal she had endured, the loneliness that nearly broke her. By the end, tears streamed down not just her own face, but on many of the women listening. "You are brave," one whispered. "You are an inspiration," said another. For the first time in so long, Amira felt seen. From then on, she made it a point to write in a small notebook every evening. At first, it was just memories. Stories of her husband, her childhood, the hardships she endured to raise her family. But gradually, her writing shifted into lessons about survival, patience, and finding hope even when abandoned. She began sharing some of these words with the women at the center, and soon they started encouraging her to write more, to maybe even publish her reflections. "Your story can help others," Khadija told her one afternoon. "So many women suffer in silence. But your words can give them courage." The thought startled Amira. She had never considered herself a teacher, let alone a writer. She had only ever been a mother, a wife, a grandmother. But maybe, just maybe, her suffering could become something more than a wound. It could become a light. Her confidence grew little by little. She began selling small embroidered cloths she sewed in her free time, something she hadn't done since her youth. To her surprise, the women at the community center loved them, paying her with gratitude and admiration. The small income wasn't much, but it was hers. It gave her back a sense of independence she had thought was lost forever. Meanwhile, at home, her children barely noticed her transformation. To them, she was still the frail old woman in the corner of the house. But Amira no longer felt like a prisoner there. The walls no longer defined her. Her spirit stretched beyond them, touching people who respected her, valued her, and looked up to her. One evening, as she sat at her desk, pen in hand, Amira looked at her reflection in the window. Her face was lined with years of hardship, her hair silver with age, her eyes tired. But behind those eyes was something new, something unbreakable. She whispered to herself, "They thought I was finished. They thought they broke me. But I am still standing. I will always stand." And in that moment, Amira realized that the sweetest revenge would not come from anger or bitterness. It would come from living well, from proving that betrayal could not destroy her spirit. The woman who had once been discarded as a burden was slowly becoming a pillar of strength, not only for herself, but for others walking the same path. Her darkest days had forged her hidden strength, and soon the world, her children included, would see just how powerful she had become. Years had passed since the nights Amira cried alone in her room, begging for answers from the heavens. Time had carved deeper lines into her face, but those lines no longer told a story of sorrow. They carried the wisdom of survival, the strength of a woman who refused to be broken. Her children still carried on with their lives, unaware of how much she had grown beyond them. To them, she remained the quiet grandmother in the background, someone to be ignored. But outside those walls, Amira had become something else entirely. Her notebook, once filled with scattered thoughts, had blossomed into a collection of essays and reflections. The women at the community center helped her edit and share them. Before long, her words spread through the neighborhood, then to nearby towns. People began referring to her as Dadi Amira, the woman who turned pain into power. She was invited to speak at small gatherings, where women, young and old, listened to her with awe. They came to her not for pity, but for strength. They saw in her a living reminder that betrayal does not have the final word. Amira, the woman once cast aside as useless, had become a source of light for countless others. The true turning point came when her son Farhan's business collapsed. Years of careless spending and arrogance had caught up with him. Debt collectors knocked on his door, and his so-called friends abandoned him when he needed help the most. Samira, too, faced her downfall. Her husband left her for another woman, leaving her with unpaid bills and the burden of raising 2 children alone. The same daughter who had once rolled her eyes at Amira now found herself drowning in tears at night. It was in these moments of despair that they turned back to the very woman they had cast aside. One rainy evening, there was a knock on Amira's door. She opened it to find Samira standing there, her clothes drenched, her face streaked with tears. Behind her stood Farhan, his once proud shoulders slumped, his eyes filled with shame. "Mama," Samira's voice broke. "We need you. We don't know where else to go." Amira's heart clenched. For years, she had dreamed of this moment, not for revenge, but for recognition. Yet now, as she stood before her broken children, she felt no desire to lash out, no temptation to remind them of their cruelty. Instead, she stood tall, her voice calm but firm. "You cast me aside when you thought I was weak. You forgot me when you thought you didn't need me. And now you come back because life has shown you otherwise. I will not throw you away as you once did to me. But do not think you can use me again." Her children wept, begging for forgiveness. But forgiveness did not mean surrender. Amira did not let them move back into her home. Instead, she directed them to the community center, where they could find support and guidance, just as she once had. She helped them find resources, but she made it clear. "You must stand on your own feet, as I learned to do. My love remains, but my blind sacrifice is gone." It was the sweetest revenge, not through cruelty, but through her independence. Her children were forced to face their failures while realizing the strength of the woman they had once mocked. In the years that followed, Amira's influence only grew. Her writings were compiled into a book, praised for their raw honesty and hope. Women from across the country wrote to her, thanking her for giving them courage to endure their own hardships. One day, at a community gathering, Noor, the granddaughter who once wrinkled her nose at her, stood proudly beside her. Now a young woman, Noor introduced her grandmother to the audience with tears in her eyes. "This is my Dottie, the woman who taught me that strength is not about never falling. It's about rising again when the world tries to break you." Amira's eyes filled with tears as applause thundered through the hall. She looked around and realized her true family was not just the children she had raised, but the countless lives she had touched with her story. That night, as she sat by her window, pen in hand, Amira wrote her final reflection. "They betrayed me, but they did not end me. They abandoned me, but I found myself. The sweetest revenge is not hatred. It is becoming stronger, wiser, and freer than they ever believed I could be. I am no longer just a mother or grandmother. I am a woman who overcame." She set down the pen, her heart light. For the first time in decades, she felt whole, not because her children had returned, but because she no longer needed them to define her worth. Her sweet revenge was complete. Amira, the forgotten grandmother, had become unforgettable.